In Paris in 1874, a group of radical young artists reached the breaking point. They were fed up with what they saw as the sorry state of French art. Fed up with having people tell them that the revolutionary new art they were making didn't measure up. Fed up most of all with having a bunch of old men keep their work out of the annual salons that could make or break an artist's career. And none of these young artists was more frustrated than a reluctant rebel named Edgar Degas. Edgar Degas came of age in Paris in a time of political, social, and artistic turmoil. Old Paris was being demolished. The most modern metropolis in Europe was rising in its place. Suddenly, old ways of looking at and depicting the world seemed out of date.
Paris in the 1860s was a real stylistic maelstrom, and we see a group of artists who knew one another and were looking over each other's shoulders, looking at all kinds of new things that were appearing on the scene.
This adventurous group included Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro, Berthe Morisot, and Paul Cézanne. Each of these young rebels had their own unique style, but they were united in their determination to create art that was as modern as the new Paris they saw rising up around them. Degas was at the heart of this revolutionary circle, but getting along with the others never came easy for him. Unlike most of the other artists in his circle, Degas came from an aristocratic and wealthy family. His expensive clothes and refined manners made him seem like a snob, and his reverence for the art of the past made him seem old-fashioned.
Degas had a very strong attachment to his idea of tradition. His formative years really were spent in Italy, from the mid-1850s till the end, when he was in Rome, in Naples, Florence, and Umbria. And there he studied the Renaissance masters, and the early Renaissance masters, especially fresco painting.
The young Degas learned to mimic the great masters in paintings like this Copy of a Crucifixion by Mantegna. But something happened to Degas while he was in Italy, something that would change him forever.
We don't know much about his private life, except that back when he was a young man and went to Italy, there's some mysterious relationship that he seems to have had and that seems to have soured him ever after. And so he was a loner and had no, that we know of, sort of relationships that were publicly known about, and did not marry and lived alone.
In his solitude, Degas buried himself in creating works based on classical subjects, like this painting of young Spartans exercising. But he soon discovered that living in the past was no cure for a broken heart.
It is the movement of people and things that distracts and even consoles, if there is still consolation to be had for one so unhappy.
Observing his fellow Parisians as they spoke and worked and played eased Degas' melancholy. Soon they, and not the ancients, would become the subject of his art.
Degas was a born and bred Parisian. He was given to depicting its society, to the way people conversed with one another, to the way they took their ease with one another, whether they were women lounging in a cafe, prostitutes lounging in the bordello, people in the audience at a singing cafe.
By the early 1870s, Degas wasn't just sketching the people he saw in the cafes, he was forging relationships with the other young artists he met there, and becoming a leader of a movement that would revolutionize the way French art was made and shown. But Degas wanted to make sure that this revolution was strictly artistic.
He was politically conservative and socially conservative. He did not want the group to be known as a radical group. But he did want to be sort of free of the market system that dominated in Paris and that was given expression in the salons.
For centuries, the annual salons sponsored by the French government had been the only places French artists could show their work. But year after year, conservative judges kept any adventurous work out of the shows. Degas was convinced it was time for a change.
To him and to many others, the salon was not only run by people whose taste was not the best, but he also thought of the salons as great sort of market halls. I think he always wanted a kind of more private, more distinguished space in which to exhibit.
By 1874, Degas and the other young artists had come up with a plan for replacing the salons with their own self-curated exhibitions. They began by transforming their informal group into an organized movement.
Degas was extremely influential, and in fact, he was one of the founders in 1874 of the group, the Société Anonyme, where the painters would get together and jury themselves and organize themselves and pay for themselves and exhibit together. And he helped finance it, he helped organize it, he was very enthusiastic about it.
With Degas leading the way, the eager young artists rented an empty building and filled it with what would become the world's first group show of modern art. Degas, who oversaw the preparations, was delighted with the results and thrilled by the way his own works were displayed.
Yesterday I saw the arrangements of the premises, the hangings, and the effect in daylight. It is as good as anywhere.
But Degas wasn't as happy when an influential critic, inspired by paintings like Monet's Impression Sunrise, decided to dub the group the Impressionists.
He would have preferred to have it called the New Painting rather than Impressionist painting, as it was called by one of the writers at the time. He didn't like Impressionist because he didn't feel that it covered him.
Impressionists like Monet, Morisot, and Renoir liked to paint their subjects on location, to spontaneously capture the fleeting effects of light in the real world. Degas preferred to work indoors.
Degas was never the kind of impressionist that Monet or Pissarro was. First of all, Degas did not paint out of doors. He painted in the studio, and one sort of sees him wearing an apron in his studio, covered with paint and his fingers smudged with pastel, looking at the model posed in a bathtub with beautiful fabrics draped around her just so that he could get the glints of color to enrich his picture. So he's not painting out of doors in the wind, in the sun, in the rain, trying to capture an effect. He's an extremely cerebral painter.
A painting is above all a product of the artist's imagination. If at a later stage he wants to add 2 or 3 touches from nature, of course it doesn't spoil anything. But the air one sees in the paintings of the masters is not the air one breathes.
For Degas, the Impressionist style showed a lack of discipline and technique, and he didn't keep his feelings to himself.
Degas was quite sarcastic about Monet and the others. He was very independent. I suppose that was some of what his cantankerousness was about. He didn't suffer fools, and he didn't like to go with the stream. I mean, he liked to swim against it.
Degas swam against the stream when it came to choosing his subjects, too. Monet and Renoir painted scenes of suburban life and middle-class leisure. But Degas searched for images that revealed the gritty reality of modern Paris, and found them in corners of the city that members of his upper-class set liked to visit in search of a cheap thrill.
I think he shared a culture with other people who went slumming, who went to the sort of night spots of Paris, to the cafes. One of the attractions of these places was that you could rub shoulders with the underclasses, prostitutes, starlets, all sorts of people. Most of his work concerns kind of lower-class, working-class women in Paris in various trades, most famously ballet dancers, but also laundresses and cafe singers and so on. Degas both identified with the people that he represented and looked down upon them. There's a kind of empathy, a physical empathy almost, for the way they move, for their gestures, for the labor that's involved in the things that they do. The sort of daily grind of ironing clothes or practicing your dance steps. Not just representing the classical ballet, but taking the least classical aspects of the ballet. The moments of repose, the moment where a dancer will yawn, scratch her back, tie a shoelace. A lot of his gestures were compared by the critics writing at the time to the gestures of brawlers and street fighters and to chickens and monkeys and frogs and so on. So there's a sense that the elbows sticking up and the feet in the air as a kind of cartoony, low-life language of gesture that interrupted the kind of beautiful fiction of the ballet.
These disruptive movements became part of Degas' repertoire. He reused and recycled them from memory, assembling and reassembling them in painting after painting to create a new type of realism, a realism that was never as real as it seemed.
Degas' work represents a singular combination of the use of line and color to make pictures that smack of reality, but which in fact are entirely artificial. That's what Degas' art is about. When people look at a great painting we have here at the Met called The Dance Class, 1874, most people assume that Degas was in the corner of that room, a room packed with 24 dancers. In fact, the room was made up. It was an amalgam of different rooms. Degas himself had never attended such an examination, and he had the dancers wear ribbons and sashes for this examination, which they never did. So he made a beautiful painting that's, I think, completely persuasive, and I would say 9 out of 10 visitors assume he was there, saw it, and painted it. But in fact, the entire thing was assembled first in his mind and then on the canvas.
As the Impressionists continued to show together in the years after 1874, Degas' unreal realism marked him as a very different artist from the other members of the group. Some began to wonder why he showed with them at all.
One of the things that the critics said over and over again, and I think actually Degas sought this out, was that he was not an Impressionist, that he was unlike the rest of the group, that what was he doing there?
And nothing set Degas further apart from the other Impressionists than his depiction of the female nude.
They were sensational at their time, and they were the opposite of the classical nude. They didn't show women as whole, beautiful, perfect specimens as if they were sculpted in marble, but rather he showed them misshapen, with short legs, with long torsos, with skinny waists. His goal, we know, was to show women as if they did not know they were being seen. He doesn't allow the model to pose for us, as again, she might pose for herself in the mirror, but instead shows her often in an unflattering position, crouching in a zinc tub. And it creates a fascinating animal-like form. Now, some people would say that Degas is being cruel to this woman, showing her in an unflattering position. Other people would say even the pretext of showing a woman unaware of her being watched is invasive and aggressive, typically masculine. But other women look at these same pictures and say Degas is being enormously sympathetic and sees women as they themselves see themselves, from an interior and sometimes even a very feminine point of view. So we have a full range of responses to Degas' nudes.
None of Degas' depictions of women elicited a wider range of responses from 19th century art lovers than the sculpture he unveiled in the Impressionist show of 1881.
The Little Dancer 14 Years was an important work in Degas' career because it was the culmination of what some of us call his scientific realism, where he was exploring certain ideas about the life of these ballet rats, as they were called, these young girls running through the halls of the Paris Opera, going from one class to the next, leading a very hard life that led up ultimately to a life of in a sense, government-sanctioned prostitution. Because unless you were a star dancer, and sometimes even if you were, the most you could hope for was to find a rich protector, usually married, who could take on these young girls as mistresses. So in the 14-year-old dancer, Degas wants us to see in her low brow, in her jutting chin, in her pug nose, the fact that her face either reveals what she will become or what she is doomed to be. Nothing more than an animal now that is being used for the pleasure of other people, first in whatever dancing she could do on the stage, and then secondly, whatever she might do in bed.
She was loved and much admired and extensively described by those who liked the new painting and hated by those who couldn't see why he was so intent on debasing the grand tradition of French sculpture and drawing.
It's fascinating to me now how beloved the sculpture has become and how mothers bring their daughters in to look at it and they both think, you know, maybe one day my daughter will become a ballerina too. But that's not at all the response that Degas intended us to have. He wanted us to see a hardened girl made mean by the life that had been imposed on her.
Degas made dozens of other sculptures over the years, but never exhibited them in public. He had other motives for creating these strange works.
I think his sculpture began as an aid to him to think about how light falls on figures.
The sculptures which he did in his studio, which he never intended to have done in bronze, although ever after they've been replicated in bronze and are all over the place, they were sketches too, just three-dimensional drawings.
I think he enjoyed the tactile process of making sculpture. He also enjoyed the mutability of sculpture, and when Wohl inquired after sculpture that he had seen in his studio the previous day or the previous week, saying, well, where is it? And Degas said, oh, it's here, and showed him a lump of clay. Actually, it's wax. And Wohl was horrified, thinking only how much money this sculpture could have made if it had been sold. And Degas said, well, you think only of the money. I think of the pleasure in making a new one.
But whether he liked to think about it or not, Degas was making money. It was this success that gave him the freedom to concentrate more on making his works and less on showing and selling them. Still, he remained disillusioned with the art-buying public, with the critics, and with some of the methods other members of the Impressionist group were using to publicize their shows.
When will they stop the headlines? In view of the frenzied advertisement made by Monet, our exhibition promises to be quite inglorious. I'm miserable about it.
He became very uncomfortable about commercial taint being associated with his name. He wanted to have private buyers and patrons and connoisseurs and print room people who would come and collect him.
When he wasn't working or receiving collectors in his studio, Degas socialized with friends from his own class. Among them, he earned a reputation as an entertaining companion with a dangerous wit.
We know that he was a cruel mime of others at the dinner table. I would love to have been at dinners with Degas. I would not want to be the butt of one of his jokes.
He was a great mimic. He loved to mimic, and in fact, there are numerous anecdotes about the way Degas at a party would mimic the way a singer would hold herself in gesture, or would mimic a laundress ironing, and see a woman getting on the tram and checking her hat or something, and he would mimic the gesture.
As Degas spent more and more time working in his studio and socializing with his upper-class peers, he saw less and less of his fellow artists. His former companions, like Alfred Sisley, Auguste Renoir, and Claude Monet, were going their own way as well. Years of exhibiting together had brought most of them fame and financial success. By the time they held their last show together in 1886, the group they had started back in 1874 had become obsolete. With its breakup, Degas' career as a reluctant rebel came to an end. But this ending turned out to be the beginning of his real rise to fame.
There's a small coterie of art critics, collectors, and art dealers who were aware of Degas' works, but he was not a household name until he was an old man. And then he became quite famous. In the 1890s, he was a kind of living legend. He was the kind of person that people assumed was already dead, but in fact was still walking around the streets of Paris.
As he had for decades, the lonely Degas found consolation in wandering through the city he loved and observing her people. But years of concentrated seeing, of peering at his subjects in dark cafes and dimly lit dance studios, had taken their toll. His eyesight began to fade away, and his will to live faded with it.
My eyes, which were burning yesterday, are swimming today. Will this ever come to an end, and how? I'm often tempted to give everything up and sleep forever.
Degas spent his final days clinging to his privacy and writing to old friends to express his regrets for injuries inflicted years earlier in his single-minded pursuit of his art.
I was, or I seemed to be, hard with everyone. I brooded against the whole world and myself. I ask your pardon sincerely if on a pretext of this damned art I have wounded a very intelligent and fine mind, perhaps even a heart.
These letters were the final expression of the pain and alienation that had haunted Edgar Degas. But even though that pain had darkened his own life, it never prevented him from making works filled with light and the joy of living. Today, these beautiful works are celebrated as some of the greatest achievements in the history of art and the legacy of one of art history's most reluctant rebels.